All right. We are all set. All set?
Mm-hmm.
All set. All right. All right, it is time to start. Greetings and welcome everybody. Happy Sunday. We sincerely hope that you are able to maintain your physical, spiritual, and mental health through the current times. We welcome everybody to this program today. Just a couple of notes before we start. First, there was a very interesting request made to us for language assistance interpretation, and we did not respond to that. And the reason we did not respond is that we're very much interested in having translation services for these seminars, but we would need to talk to folks and know you in this day and time when so many people want to silence the voices of African revolutionaries. I'm sure you understand our hesitation in giving anybody access to our program before they're properly vetted. So those folks who are interested in that, we're happy to talk with you and figure out how we can make that happen going forward. Thank you for your concern. And then the other thing we wanted to address is since our last seminar last week, I have now 2 housemates that are parakeets, and they're sitting right here. And I've talked to them about respecting this hour in this program, but they have very strong political opinions, which they absolutely have to live in this house. And so you may hear them throughout the course of the program because they are very much interested in expressing their point of view, which I absolutely encourage. And along that note, as always, for the people who join through Zoom, everybody's muted. You will not have the ability to unmute yourself, but what you can do, if you have comments or questions, you can write them in the chat section. You use that by clicking on your menu at the bottom of your screen, chat. You can type in, we'll be watching so we can get back to you with responses. All right, so again, thank you to everybody who has joined. We start, as we always do, by giving much thanks and appreciation to the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere, the native peoples of the Western Hemisphere. And when I say that, I mean those who call themselves indigenous, native, Chicano, Mexicano, Latino. All of them are the descendants of the people who were here before anyone else and whose land was viciously and violently stolen from them by a settler colonial process. So we acknowledge that the last 500 plus years has been the result of us benefiting from their suffering. So we thank them for their caretaking of this land. And we also, of course, thank our African ancestors who, contrary to the vicious lies being told today by some who, in a just a shameful effort, want to profit off of our current suffering, are spreading the lies that our people didn't fight for us. It didn't fight against the forces who were attempting to kidnap us and colonize and dominate Africa. And so we know from studying history that from the eastern shores of Africa, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, Djibouti, all the way out to the western shores of the Western Hemisphere, here our people fought our oppression every step of the way. And anyone who doesn't know that hasn't studied our history, period. So we thank our ancestors for engaging in that struggle. We appreciate them, and we are here as the living legacy of their contribution and their sacrifice and their suffering. So we're so thankful to them. And we will just go ahead and get started. Shakura is here with me, and so we're going to share this presentation with you. Very important topic today, policing and white supremacy. And, we just want to make it clear that from our standpoint, when you say police and white supremacy, you're saying the exact same thing. You're saying nothing except the manifestation of an institution that was created specifically to repress and oppress. And we want to use the next hour to demonstrate why we believe that. So, we just want to be clear about that. As we tell our children in our Saturday school, the police are not your friend. And so that is the basis of this. And we will talk about it, like I said, in a very clear fashion. And we encourage debate because we understand that in these capitalist societies, we are constantly propagandized that the police are people that we need to respect, and that when something goes wrong and police are involved in something that should not have happened, that's just simply an aberration. But the foundation is that the police are fundamentally a positive organization in communities. And so the purpose of today is to smash that myth and to say that that's a lie, that's not true, it never has been true, and it never will be true. And so with that, we'll go ahead and get started. And as always, we want to do introductions. This is an event sponsored by the All African People's Revolutionary Party, All African People's Revolutionary Party. And we are a mass independent revolutionary Pan-African party based in Africa. I've been a longtime member of the AAPRP, organizing for the AAPRP all over the globe. And then with me is my amazing daughter, Shakura, who actually grew up within the process of the AAPRP. From the time she was born, she was raised within the AAPRP. Many of you, when you were born, you might have been born, you might have recollections of your childhood going to people's houses and social events and that sort of thing. For Shakura, a lot of her youth was spent at AAPRP functions, social as well as political, no separation between the two. And so she is right now continuing her activism as a strong supporter of the AAPRP, PhD student in communications and public health, and someone who is very passionate about the health issues, particularly of African women, working poor African women, and is involved directly in organizing programs designed to address those fundamental issues. In terms of the AAPRP, again, our objective is Pan-Africanism, which we define as one unified socialist Africa, one unified socialist Africa. That's what we're working for. And so to accomplish that objective, we have chapters all over the African world, all over Africa, Europe, and the Americas. And our strategy is outlined in the book you see to the right, the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, to unite all African revolutionary foundations on the ground into one worldwide fighting force. And we'll talk about African Liberation Day a little bit today, because that is a week from tomorrow, and there's a virtual program. And it's something that you definitely do not want to miss, because there's nothing else you're going to see like African Liberation Day. There's nothing else that brings together Africans from all over the world speaking in one voice. And that's what African Liberation Day will do a week from Monday. We have participants from Zimbabwe, Ghana, Guinea-Bissau, Kenya, Tanzania, Azania, which you call South Africa. We'll have people from Europe. We have people from Cuba, Venezuela, and you just will never see that on CIA and CNN networks. So we'll give you more information about it. Our theme this year is imperialist sanctions on Zimbabwe, Cuba, and Venezuela are acts of war. Africans everywhere must fight. So we'll talk a little more about that. But that's what the AAPRP is. That's the work that we're doing on the ground throughout the world. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started with the topic for today: why we can do so much better than police. So let's start with just a brief history of police in North America, specifically talking about the United Snakes of America as well as Canada. So if you start with Canada, the history of police there is right now the national police, the federal police in Canada are called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. But initially their name was the Northwest Mounted Police. And they were formed in the early 1870s, initially as a team of 300 trained agents whose job specifically was to terrorize the indigenous people, or what they call in Canada, First Nations people, and drive them off of the land that was being prospected by the Canadian Pacific Railway to build the Canadian Railway, which exists to this day. So their specific job was to travel around to these routes that were determined by this Canadian Pacific Railway and to terrorize the First Nations people off that land so that they could begin to engage in the prospects of building the railway. So, now with that, today, police in Canada serve basically the same function as it relates to First Nations people and African people. In fact, they have a process called Search and Stop and Search, which is active in the Halifax, Nova Scotia area of Canada. And that has posed tremendous problems for the African population there. And if you want to know more about that, we are actually, myself and another comrade in the AAPRP who lives in that area of Canada are hosting a session on May 27th to speak specifically to police terrorism and African people in Canada. But that's the history of how Canadian police departments were developed. And then there's another element, to the local police there. And then if you look at the US, the first police departments in this country emerged in the 1880s also. And the initial recruits, if you look at the old Western movies, they essentially were correct when they depicted police as a sheriff and a deputy in the townships. They were being established out here in the West. But after the Civil War and the elimination of chattel slavery as a political and economic institution in this country, these townships, cities, and developing urban areas begin to develop departments to engage in the policing in their areas. And many of the recruits who were the initial people who participated in those departments were people who were hired, who had participated in posses. This is where the term posse comes from. They were posses who, their job, they were hired by the plantation industries in the southern US. And when the Africans left the plantation, obviously wanting to find and fulfill a better life outside of the trauma and the terror of the slave plantations, they would come out west. And the job of these people in these posses was to find them and terrorize them into going back to the South, because as you can imagine, the plantation industry suffered a severe hit, like anyone would, when you no longer could rely on free labor for your production. So this was the role of these people. And then these were the folks, again, who became the initial police recruits who were engaged in that process of developing police departments. And the picture on the top is actually my favorite movie of all time, Buck and the Preacher. And it stars Sidney Poitier, who's on the right, Ruby Dee in the middle, and Harry Belafonte on the left. And this movie actually depicts what I just got through talking to you about. It came out in 1972. I saw it as a child. I've probably seen it 30 times, and I can watch it another 30 times. But what the movie is about is it shows how Sidney Poitier and then eventually Harry Belafonte, they team up to go after these posses who are robbing, terrorizing these African wagon trains that are just trying to leave the South and come up north or out west to find a better life, robbing them, sexually assaulting the women, everything. And so they're trying their best to stop that. And then one of the interesting things about that movie, made almost 50 years ago, is in order for Sidney and Harry to have passage through the plains, they had a relationship with the indigenous people who were still out in the plains during that time, and they would allow them to pass, but they wouldn't allow the posses to pass. So, just a lot of really good history, even though it was a Hollywood movie. Obviously, this movie is different than most of the movies you're used to watching, because the people you see in this picture had a whole lot to do with, how the movie was released. But it does depict what I just got through talking about, how these terrorists became the initial shock troops for police departments in this country. And that's important because understanding that history thoroughly obliterates the myth that police were ever here to serve any of us. You know, they came out of the process of terrorizing us. The institution of slavery, the Civil War, all of that was about terror for African people. That's why the Confederate flag symbolizes that for African people. And, you know, all of us, it's amazing how, you know, you hear all these Europeans talking about heritage, it's their heritage. And the overwhelming majority of African people in this country are here because of slavery. So that means our history comes through the Southern US. So here we have these white people telling us today, well, it's about our heritage, and all of our families are from the South. My family's from Louisiana, but our families never talked about and never talk about the South the way these people, you know, that most of whom never even been in the South, romanticize the South. And our people have the actual experiences of terror in the Southern US. And these people are telling us it's heritage and history. I mean, that's like, that's so feeble-minded that, you know, it would be humorous if it wasn't so feeble-minded and so indicative of the contradictions of education in this society. So the picture on the bottom is just a picture of police in Halifax, Canada, who are brutalizing an African. And you didn't know it was a Halifax, Canada. You thought that picture was in LA or New York or Oakland or Chicago, because it's a universal problem of how police interact with our people based on this history. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to Shakura, who's gonna talk further about white supremacy and police.
Okay, so as we continue thinking about the history of police, not just in this country, but throughout the world, I want us to try to intersect that with the idea of white supremacy and also this idea of how does civil rights play into that, because there is quite an intersection. So I want to pay homage to the three young men at the top of the slide. Their names are Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Swerner. They were a part of the Southern Christian Leadership Union, and they were murdered working on civil rights tactics that were in place to help people in a small city in Mississippi known as Philadelphia, and they were murdered in their work of doing that. I want to also pay homage to them because I think a lot of times, whether it's cases of sexual assault or cases of rape, our society tends to focus on the person who did the act and not so much the people who were impacted by that person. So it's really important that we again acknowledge Andrew, James, and Michael because of their work, their legacy reigns true. And that actually interlined quite nicely with me moving to Memphis. And I'll talk more about that in the next slide. But it's just important to acknowledge that. And so, of course, to acknowledge them and to acknowledge the work they were doing in Philadelphia would also be important for us to keep in mind that their comrades knew that something was wrong because they were sent to do this task in Philadelphia and then they weren't heard from again. So the comrades had an idea that something had gone wrong. And the young man that you see, or the older man, I should say, at the bottom of the slide, Cecil Price, his day job, I should say, was deputy sheriff of the Philadelphia police force. But it's also really important to note that there's also an intersection with the Ku Klux Klan and police forces because he was known as a documented KKK member and he played a direct role in the murdering of those three young men. So like, what does this intersection look like when it comes to white supremacy and when it comes to police and the history of that and civil rights? And then also like, how does the Ku Klux Klan play into that? Those are not mutually exclusive. They are connected in more ways than one. And I think it's really important as we continue thinking about how things are done and how things are shushed and pushed under the rug, as it turns out that three bodies are just missing and those three people are never accounted for. Next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit about how that contributed to me moving to the South. And so I want to first take a note and say that because I was trying to get some business in order before I moved to Memphis, I paid a visit to Memphis, Tennessee, and my dad met me here. And we decided to take a trip and visit Philadelphia for ourselves because we wanted to better understand the history. And so, of course, you could read books and you could, read newspaper articles, but Philadelphia is not that far from Memphis. So we rented a car and drove down there because, again, like if you're in the heart of it, you want to understand what's going on. So because I planned to move here and needed to take care of business, we went to Philadelphia because it was something that we wanted to do so that we could not only pay homage to the ancestors, but also better understand what was going on. And I remember distinctly, my dad can back me up, as soon as we got there, there was like a aura, if you will, and I felt like we were on display. And I mean that to say it was very clear for the residents who lived there that we were not from there, and just the attitude and the perceptions, all of this perceived idea, I guess, of our experience there was very clearly noted. I felt like we were unique, and I felt like people knew that we were out of place, I guess is a way to say it. It was also very clear that because these murders took place so long ago, that was not a common conversation that people are currently having. And that's an experience that I can share here in Memphis as well. Like, the history of civil rights in general is not easily spoke about. And whether that's related to trauma, whether that's related to uncomfort, whatever the reason is, it's not being talked about as openly as maybe in other parts of the world. And so I think that there could be detriments to that, because that means that our children are not understanding their history. And so if you think about the Sankofa bird, you have to know where you came from in order to know where you're going. So I think it's important to note that. And I remember my dad and I going to a restaurant, and the people who served us, of course, they commented because our accents were different, but more importantly, just our demeanor. They knew we weren't from there, and they asked that repeatedly. And so I'm trying to paint a picture that you could cut the distance, you could cut the desertedness, you could cut all of that in the town with a really thick knife, because it was very awkward being there, because we knew that there were some things going on and people just weren't talking about them for multiple reasons. Next slide. Okay, so I talked a little bit about white supremacy and police, and just to back up more of what I'm saying, it's very clear, if you're gonna have the conversation about white supremacy, you can't talk about that without talking about the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI. That also means the CIA, all these units that are connected and all mounted basically on the same soil that is tainted, to say colonialism gave birth to white supremacy, which gave birth to racism. So because of that, even racist US Federal Bureau of Investigation issued a report in 2016 warning that police departments throughout the United States were mass infected with Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazi, and all forms of white supremacists. So not to be taint, but it's almost like, in order to be a police officer, that might have been like something that you were willing to do, was be a part of this KKK organization as a way of being hazed, perhaps, or maybe just as a way of having a dual role, right? So like I said, your day job may be police, but by nightfall, you were known to go and terrorize families. Maybe at nightfall, you were known to go and terrorize women, or Jews, or other people who didn't fit the normative profile of what an American is supposed to look or identify as. So I just think it's really important, as we continue to think about that intersection of all those things. Thank you.
All right, it reminds me of when I was a young man, before I joined the APRP, the first organization I joined was called the Pan-African Secretariat. And I didn't stay with them long, but I did learn a lot about self-defense from them, and a lot of those types of skills that I've maintained throughout my life. But one of the brothers who was very active in recruiting me in there, he's still around. He still is in Central California. His name is Kahinde Sawazi. And what Brother Kahinde used to always say to me is that the Ku Klux Klan is for those of us that move to the suburbs, because if we live in the cities, that's what the police are for. And, I always used to laugh when he said that to me, but now today, I really realize the truth in what he was talking about, because that's, like Shakur just got through saying, that's essentially how the system works, is that people serve as police during the day, but really a lot of the reason why they want to become police is so that they can engage in their terrorist activities against us, when they're not in uniform, or even when they are in uniform. Either or, because if they're in uniform, then that gives them the ability to carry out that terror with impunity. And when they're not in uniform, they can just do whatever they want, and they know that there's not gonna be a push to hold them accountable, because they're the ones who are supposedly there to do that. So it's just really important that folks understand that, especially today in this country alone, like, police kill over 1,000 people every year. Give or take a few, about half of them are Africans. We see it all the time. And so this is, if you look at like police departments across this country, they spend so many hours training on force and virtually no time training on how to effectively interact with people when there's conflict. So they're not, contrary to popular belief, they are not trained to deal with conflict in any way other than force. That's why, people call the police to come when someone has a mental illness and the person with the mental illness ends up dead or injured. That's the reason why that happens. These people are not qualified, nor do they have the motivation nor the desire to engage in conflict resolution. Their training is specifically to deal with force. And a lot of them, the percentage of people who are police who are uncontrolled alcoholics, sexual assault perpetuators, the percentage of police who commit suicide is overwhelmingly high. And so that speaks to me to the reality that they are not only are they not prepared to, engage in the social situations that, their job requires them to do that, but many of them are just not equipped to do that. And so this creates, if you add on top of that, this concept of toxic masculinity, whether it's a man or not, the institution has that, and this desire to inflict harm on people as a way of repressing them, then you just have a very volatile situation that in no way helps us be able to protect ourselves and move forward. And so that's why typically our experiences with police are oppressive. They're negative situations. And people always try to individualize that to justify it. So this is what I'm talking about. You make a statement like, the police, that's a terrorist institution. And then people always respond by saying things like, well, my brother is a police, my sister is a police, my husband, my wife, my whoever is a police. And so you can't generalize that. And I think what we have to begin to do is confront that logic, because that logic it's not strong logic. Number one, when you're whoever that's the police, the question for you is, what role have they played in stopping the brutality the police inflict on colonized communities? Because if you can't say, well, my person that's in this police department, they actually stopped police in that entire department from terrorizing African people or indigenous people or other oppressed people, then what use is it for you to talk about the fact that they're in the police? That does us no good. It does nothing to help us address the brutality that we face from the police. So you talking about the individual person is useless, it's worthless. So it means nothing to us. And so we also, that's because we understand the police are an institution. It's not about the individuals, it's about the institution. And the way we can prove that is when the police carry out an act of terror against us, there's never any large percentage of police who rise up and say, that's wrong, that's not what happened, they committed acts of terrorism. For the most part, that happens on an individual basis, 1 or 2 times that's happened. But for the most part, the practice is complete silence to the official police version. And there are, countless examples of that. But the example that I'll give that comes to mind is when I lived in before I lived in Portland, but when I lived in Portland, Oregon, I became aware of it. There was a young sister there named Kendra James, who in 2003, she was killed by the Portland Police Bureau on an overpass over Interstate 5 in Northeast Portland late at night. And so they said that she moved from the back seat into the front seat of the car and started trying to roll the car and hit the police. So they pulled out their service weapons and opened fire, killing her. And what ended up coming out is that all of the police, I think there were 4 or 5 of them, if memory serves me correctly, who were involved in that. They went to a restaurant, which was up the street there on Interstate Boulevard in Portland, and they sat down at a table and ordered food, and they worked to get their stories straight. They worked to make sure they were all on the same page. The story they came up with was not the truth, but they just wanted to make sure they all had the same story. And this came out from the food servers who were in the restaurant, other customers in the restaurant who saw them in there. It didn't come from other police that were there. It wasn't like police came forward and said, yeah, this is really what happened. It's not really like they said. So this so-called blue wall of silence that is a real thing. This is clear evidence that when you talk about police, you're talking about a conspiracy. You're talking about institutional commitment to oppression. You know, so police, I mean, it's a joke for police to be talking to our people about how bad it is that people won't snitch when there's a crime in the neighborhood. Police wrote the handbook on not snitching because they never snitch on each other. So it's a joke for them to criticize us for not doing that. All we're doing is practicing what we've learned from them. They don't snitch on each other when they commit acts of terror against us. So that's clear evidence that it's an institutional problem that we're talking about when we talk about police. Because even if you have the best intentions and you join the police force, you know that it is not in your safety to expose what the police are doing. And I'll give one more quick example to demonstrate that. There used to be a brother who was in the party for many years in the Bay Area. Won't name this person, but they talked about how they had gone, before they came to us, they had gone and went through a police academy, and they started functioning as a San Francisco police officer. So I'm from San Francisco, so nobody can tell me that the San Francisco Police Department is not one of the most brutal police departments that exists, because I've personally experienced their brutality on multiple occasions. So this African would tell the story of how one day they were trying to organize what they called a Black Police Officers Association in a sincere attempt to try and address the contradictions they observed between communications and existence of the San Francisco Police Department and the African communities there. So they're trying to get this African police unit together to try to address that. And so one day they get a call to go to this house. And when they get to the house, there's no one there. And they said from the looks of it, there hadn't been anybody that lived there, was there for quite some time. But they're in this room with these 3 white police officers. And so they asked the question, like, well, what's this call about? Like, there's nothing happening here. And they said that one of the cops turned towards them. They all unbuckled their weapons, and they turned towards them and they said, well, we just thought it was important that you understand that when you take this job, it's important that the people you work with trust you and feel like they can rely on you to have our backs. And then they all put their hands on their weapons. And they said, because anything can happen to you on this job. Anything can happen to you. And that brother got the message. And from that point forward, he didn't make any more efforts to organize this Black Police Officers Association. And, it wasn't long after that he decided it wasn't in his best interest to remain a police officer. So that's an example, you all, that this is an institution. So it's irrelevant and it's absurd and it's really insulting. We're not trying to hear you talk to us about your brother who's on the police force or your daddy or whoever, because clearly they have no ability to have an influence on the extent to which police terrorize us. So talking to us about them is worthless. Only thing they're able to do is just fall in line and at the very best, just not say anything. Or maybe when they get older, after all the brutality has happened, write a book or something. But that's it. When they work for that institution, they are really in a position where they have to accept, and by accept, that means support what that institution is doing. And that's just objectively true. So there are answers that we have as to how to address this, because people are saying, well, if you're saying that the police are criminals, yeah, that's what we're saying. You're saying that police institutions are terrorist organizations. Yes, that's exactly what we're saying. Then, well, what is the alternative? Because if I have a problem, I don't feel comfortable being able to protect myself. So what else do I have? I mean, at least if I can call the police, that's a better chance than what I would have by myself. And there is a lot of sound logic in that argument. And we understand and are very empathetic to that. And so that's why we're involved in attempting to create institutions that can address that reality. So the first question we have to ask, though, is how many of us really believe that we have the capacity to create a better reality among ourselves? In other words, how many of us are ready to accept the notion that we can build capacity among our people so that we don't need police? Do people really believe that? Or do you believe, yeah, there's not really any way we can really function on our own without these state institutions? Like, we really need these state institutions and there's nothing we can do about that. Because if you believe that last thing I said, then we're really not talking to you. You know, we're really talking about what we can do to address this on our own. So before I go to the next slide, I see that someone has a question, but we are not going to be able to unmute anyone. So what I want to ask is, like, if people can go in the chat and just write your question, that would be great, and we'll address it. And again, the reason why we do it like that is because, you know, there are people here who want to disrupt this type of information from reaching you. So this is a way we can have the most secure platform. So apologies for that. But if you can ask your question in the chat, then Shakur and I will definitely address it. Okay, so, you know, understanding that we can create the reality where we protect ourselves. So that starts there. You know, as the saying goes, power starts at conception. So the conception that we can create institutions on our own outside of state agency police to protect our communities. So this is where this concept of community defense comes in that we've been talking about. And community defense means no police whatsoever. So there's actually a complete seminar like this that we did on community defense. You can see the video on YouTube. It's entitled Building Revolutionary Community Defense. Strongly encourage you to watch it, because what that presentation entailed was going step by step on how we organize communities so that we can build capacity, so we don't need the people in the community organize themselves, so that they have what they need to resolve contradictions in the community, and people don't feel like they have to call police, who never seem to make it better, only seem to make it worse. So encourage you to watch that. And then once you watch that, again, as always, as we always say publicly, we are willing to help people build these institutions in your community. All you have to do is reach out to us, and we'll work with you up to and including coming to you no matter where you are and helping you build something. As long as you're serious, we'll be serious. So if people want to do that, that's something that's very important that has to be done. But again, you know, we have to recognize that this is not an action movie that we're talking about. This is not an action movie we're watching. This is real people. So we cannot have revolutionary societies without revolutionaries. So the way we create revolutionaries is we have to have a process to create revolutionaries. Revolutionaries, it's not like becoming a Christian, and I'm not in any way throwing shade at Christians or Muslims, or I have much respect for whatever faith you are, provided you're using your faith to advance humanity. If you're not using your faith to do that, then you're not really following what that faith should be about. But provided you're doing that, we have every bit of respect for you. But you know, in Christianity, you can commit all types of sins, and then you repent and you decide to move your life in a positive direction, and then you become a Christian. And that's a beautiful thing, but becoming a revolutionary doesn't work like that. It's a process. You can't just repent against capitalism and then the next day, you know, you're a revolutionary. It requires work on your part. It requires you joining an organization. You know, I'm tired of talking to people who claim they're revolutionaries and they don't even have an organization. Revolution is a mass activity. Revolutions aren't carried out by one person. That's a movie. That's Hollywood. But in real life, revolutions, one white man doesn't save the day like in the movies. Revolutions require masses of people, millions of people engaged in the process to make change. So that, just understanding that requires organization. So you have to be in an organization. I don't care how much you don't like organization. I don't even know if I like organization, but I'm committed to it because I know that's the only way that we can solve these problems. So you have to be a part of an organization. There's anybody arguing against that is just not serious about addressing these changes, because they can't solve the problem by themselves. And if they could, they would have done it already. They wouldn't have to talk to you about it. You know, it was a person that came to a meeting once and they were like, I'm an individualist. I don't believe in it. And I told them, why are you here? Why don't you just leave? It doesn't make sense for you to be here, because this is about people coming together to solve problems. So we don't need you here. Nobody wants to hear you say that. We don't believe that. We don't believe what you're talking about. So you should leave. So if you're really about change, you have to be about organization. As Kwame Ture said, organization is the weapon of the oppressed. So we need everybody in organizations. And of course, those organizations have to be based on political education, meaning you have to have a program in place. You can't just read a book here and there and think that you're engaging in political education. It requires you making a commitment to studying what's going on with other people and engaging in a process so that you can begin to understand. Because look, dig it, this system is engaged in 24/7 propaganda against you and me. No question about that. It's engaged in 24/7, 365 days a year propaganda to get you to believe a certain way. I'll give you a quick example. It has been 37 years since I have eaten a beef hamburger. 37 years. But yet, I can tell you right now, the McDonald's jingle, to all beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. And even though it's been 4 decades since I've eaten anything like that, their propaganda is so strong that it sticks with me even all this time since I've even eaten anything like that. So that tells you how serious they are about propaganda, because even though I learned that when I was a kid, they still kept beaming it at me. And even though I don't think they even use that, and it's been years since they used that slogan, it's still in your subconscious. It still influences you when you feel like you're starting to get hungry. That's how serious they are about propaganda. So if we're going to defeat that level of organization, we have to be organized with a higher level of propaganda. So that means constant political education. You can't just, they didn't just put that McDonald's jingle out there once every 2 years, like most of us read a book once every 2 years. They were engaged in constant propaganda. So that means our work study process functions like this. You go every 2 weeks, you read 70 pages every 2 weeks, 5 pages a day. You rotate facilitatorship, so people learn how to facilitate, how to lead sessions, how to be engaged, those skills. And so that's what we need everybody to know how to do, not just a few of us. Everybody needs to have those skills. So that's the purpose of your political education program, to help everyone earn those skills. And then on top of that, to have criticism, self-criticism as a tool you use in your political education process, so that when someone doesn't read, as a collective, you come together to help them figure out how they can get comfortable reading the material. Everybody's responsibility is to help them do that. It's not just an individual problem. And so when you have that level of criticism, self-criticism attached to your political education process, then now you have an ideological training process. And imagine if we had the majority of people, if we had millions of people even engaged in that process, that in and of itself would make such a difference in this world. Just think about that. Millions of people engaged in the process I just discussed. There's no way you can argue that would not take us to a higher qualitative level as a human society. Because the problem we have right now is that most people aren't engaged in any level of community or political education. Most of what they know is about celebrities and nothing about the conditions that impact us. That's why conspiracy theories run wild. People don't have, tools of analysis to break down situations. They can't, properly, they don't have the skills to do that, but they can gain that. They can get that. So that's what we have to do. I just wrote an article on my blog, like, don't be like Mike, be like Kwame. To stop glorifying Michael Jordan and even Kobe Bryant. I know he just died, but these were people who they provided great entertainment, but they did nothing to advance the collective struggle of the masses of our people. And I'm sorry, but I don't have any obligation to recognize your trauma behind Kobe Bryant dying when you don't care anything about the thousands of Congolese sisters that die every day. You didn't stop to think about that. I'm concerned about that because he only had 41 years, but they were very good 41 years, and nobody should have to die tragically. But the reality in this oppressed world is that millions of people die tragically every day. So to me, it makes no sense to just single out one person who's a millionaire or billionaire when you say nothing about the millions of people who suffer needlessly. So, you know, this is why political education is so important, because we come to understand that type of thing and not just be propagandized by ESPN and ABC and CIA who are telling us, no, this is what you need to care about, not this over here. What we tell you, that's what you need to care about. So that's why we say that way. So that's what we mean when we say political education. And once we have this type of political education institutionalized, we have community defense institutionalized, the police become a figment of our imagination. They no longer can exist because when they come, first, nobody's calling them. And even if they come, people are like, we don't need you. You're not welcome here. You know, we don't need you here. Go away. And we can begin to defend our communities and then stop the reliance on terrorists who come into our communities and make our situations worse. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about how we can effectively address this. But again, power begins at conception. So if you don't really believe that, like you don't have any faith in people, and you don't think people are capable of coming together, then nothing that we're talking about is going to make sense to you. What we're talking about is for people who believe that people can come together. And then just one last thing, if you are one of those people who doesn't believe people can come together, then I would just say in closing that, you know, you need to check that elitism that you have, because that is an elitist concept that you think people can't come together, because really what you're saying is that you can understand something, but you don't think other people can understand. And none of us came out of the womb understanding anything. Everything we know, we learned. Somebody took the time and taught us. So there's nobody here that can say, well, I know something and you don't know how to know what I know. We all can know what we all can know, and then more. It just has to be put in practice. And that's what these institutions are designed to do. Okay, so, you know, just want to talk about one of the, you know, community defense efforts we work on a large scale is our Pan-African work on the ground. And again, I talked about African Liberation Day a week from tomorrow, and really want to invite you all to participate. I actually wrote an article on my blog there yesterday that's it's called African Liberation Against White Supremacy, African Liberation Day for Beginners. So it just explains to you that African Liberation Day is an institution against imperialism and capitalism. That's what it is. It's an institution to unite African people around this concept of unity. And if you participate in the program next week, you'll see that this work has been undertaken. It's happening. It's going on right now. So we encourage you to participate. The program, you know, obviously covers many time zones. So depending upon what time zone you're in, you know, you have to be aware of that to pick up the broadcast. It'll be a 3-hour broadcast, but it's important because this is designed to we're not just organizing this program so that, you know, we can say, hey, look at us. The purpose of this is to help people understand that we can build institutions that can guide us towards victory. You know, the enemies of humanity, they have all these institutions, all these propaganda mechanisms that are designed to influence you into supporting their agenda, whether they do that subtly or overtly. They're influencing you to support their agenda. So, you know, right now we're look at what's coming up. We're looking at Memorial Day, and that's supposed to be about the people who have died in service to US imperialism. So the underlining thing to that is they don't care about those people that died. Clearly they don't care, because you can just drive by any freeway off ramp, and there's plenty of war veterans on those off ramps. I talk to them practically every day, because there are a lot of them that live here where I live, in the area I live in. I'm in the downtown area, so I talk to them all the time. And if you talk to them like I do, you know that nobody cares about them because they talk about how mistreated they are, not just by people on the street, but by the institutions that supposedly are there to protect them and take care of them. So don't give me that garbage. You know, nobody cares about them. The purpose of Memorial Day is to convince you that you need to support U.S. imperialism, that when they go to war, you need to support that. That's the real reason behind it. And then when they come back with the 4th of July on July 4th, the purpose of that is to get you to support American imperialism, no matter what it does, no matter who it oppresses, to support it. And that propaganda is so strong that a lot of Africans will be like, yeah, I'm still, what are you doing for the 4th? And I'm like, that's a day of mourning for us. Chattel slavery was in full effect on July 4th, 1776. So what the hell are we doing celebrating the 4th of July? That's absurd. But yet a lot of us do, because we've been propagandized to do that. And we don't have anything else telling us anything different. So the purpose of African Liberation Day is to provide a counterbalance of justice to that terrorism, to do that. You know, we should not be, people always, they kill me. They come to me and they say in November, have a good Thanksgiving. And I always respond, I don't celebrate Thanksgiving. That's annihilation of the indigenous people. And then they always come back with, well, I don't celebrate it either. But you came to me and said, have a good Thanksgiving. You didn't say, hey, have a couple of days off. Because if you'd said that, I wouldn't have said anything. You said have a good Thanksgiving. So you cannot now come say, well, I don't celebrate it. No, you do celebrate it. You may not do it consciously, but somewhere in your subconscious is that thought that this land belongs, this land is your land, this land is our land. Somewhere in your thought process is that backward thought. And I understand the history of the song. I don't need a lecture on that, but I'm just making the point that these institutions are designed to propagandize us. So we come with African Liberation Day as a methodology to give us positive revolutionary political education. So we encourage you to participate that. It's a day of strategy to achieve revolutionary Pan-Africanism and to also talk about our efforts on the ground in Africa, as well as our support for other institutions, other national liberation movements, Palestinian, Irish, indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, Filipino, all of these other struggles that are engaged against the same enemies that we are. And they will, have solidarity statements, and we're working to get all those translated because it's an international program, and we're going to do the best we can to make it as robust as we possibly can. But think about that. If you're African, if you're not African, think about how you can build a community defense program. And it doesn't take 40 people to start. It really just takes you being dedicated to do it. And you got people here, again, I'll say it, who will help you put it in place. Okay. So the last thing we have here is we just want to talk about the resources that we have. But before we do that, let's look and see if we have any questions. Okay, looks like everything's clear. Thank you, thank you. Okay, so we will keep moving and just say that there are resources here. Again, African Liberation Day, you can look at the time, 8:30 a.m. Pacific time, 9:30 Mountain Time, 10:30 a.m. Central Time, 11:30 a.m. Pacific or Eastern Standard Time, 3:30 p.m. Ghana, West Africa time, and 5:30 p.m. Azania, South African time. That's going to be the time for the event on Monday, May 25th. You're off for Memorial Day, so you have no other thing to do other than tune in and get you some of this rich soul food of African liberation and liberation for all people on the planet. There's going to be a lot of Pan-African edutainment. It's going to be an outstanding event. And then we just want to also encourage you to go to the site, the All African People's Revolutionary Party International site, AAPRP/INTL.org. There's articles up there about the impacts of COVID-19 on Africa, and also articles about African Liberation Day and the work that we're doing on the ground in Africa. And then I mentioned my blog. Please go there. There's the white supremacy, against white supremacy, African Liberation Day for Beginners, just explaining to you what it's all about. The article I wrote a couple of days, that one's there. And then the article I wrote a couple of days ago, Don't Be Like Mike, Be Like Kwame. So check those out. And then hoodcommunist.org has a number of outstanding articles, and I'm honored. The African revolutionaries right there. I'm honored to contribute there from time to time as well. Then also our African Liberation Day site, which is separate from the site at the top, which is our AAPRP International site. The African Liberation Day.net site is specific to African Liberation Days around the world. So you can go there and you can find out where African Liberation Days are happening, or this year, because they're all virtual, from where they're happening from. There are a number of African Liberation Days. A lot of people outside of the APRP host it, so check it out. We support African liberation, period. We don't have a gang mentality about that. So we encourage you to support as many African Liberation Days that you can, no matter who's doing them. I know that the African People's Socialist Party, I believe they're hosting African Liberation Day. You should support it. There's a group in Guyana that supports African Liberation Day. You should support it. There's another group in Ghana outside of the APRP there who's hosting African Liberation Day. You should support that one. Just support it and find out what's going on, because at the very least, what you'll find is that, man, there's a lot of this work going on the ground among African people. And that's not something you're gonna learn by watching MSNBC. So go ahead and do that and check that out. And the last thing is we wanna invite you to an informational session to learn more about the All African People's Revolutionary Party. If you wanna write in the chat, if you're interested in that, we'll follow up with you and we'll schedule that with you. And if you're not African, but you're like, I want to do something, this resonates with me, I believe it, I want to make it happen, equally as much, we will work with you to help you develop a process to start an organization. We have a lot of experience doing that. We have done that multiple times. We will continue to do it. So if you want to do the work, you've got people who are here to support you. But again, organization is the weapon of the oppressed. If we are not willing to get organized, we have no way to stop the oppression against us. And if we have no way to stop the oppression against us, I'm gonna say this, I used to say this all the time and I stopped saying it, and I don't know why I stopped saying it, I'm gonna start saying it again. So what I used to say is, if you are not going to do something to help humanity, then at the very least, go to your phone book or your Google now and Google the police department, the Ku Klux Klan. It's the same thing. So if you call police, you're calling the Klan and the neo-Nazis. Call them up and say, hey, I'm here right now. I want you to come and get me, because at least if you're not willing to do something for humanity, the least you should be willing to do is die for humanity. So that's our statement for today, but we don't want anybody to die. We want you to join organizations working for justice. Find some organization that's doing that. If you don't see one, then start the I wish this was their last seminar organization, and start your organization. And if you can develop a better organizational plan than we are, then we'll join you in your work. We are not egotistical about this work. We just want to win. We want the masses of people to win. So we'll listen and work with anybody who has a good plan. So let's do that. And at this point, I will stop. I don't see any questions. Do you, Shakur? Do you see any? I don't see anything.
I do not, because I think you noted the comments that you saw previously.
Excellent. Well, we want to thank you. And we'll just say right now, since next week is African Liberation Day week, our seminar next week is just going to be specific to African Liberation Day, talking about what it is, what it means for us as African people and all oppressed people in the world, and why we should celebrate and build up institutions like that. So that's what we're going to be dealing with next Sunday. So we want to wish you a very good rest of your Sunday afternoon. Forward ever, backwards never. All the information here. We really do hope to hear from you. And we want to hear from you and hear what you think. And we don't want to just hear what you think. We want to hear what you're willing to do also. Because if you're not willing to do anything, we really not that concerned about what you think. But if you're wanting to do something, we want to hear what you think. And, you know, we would love to develop relationships. So have a good rest of your Sunday. Forward ever, backwards never, ready for revolution. Have a great rest of the day.